There was graffiti all over London in 1966 that said 3 words: Clapton is God. Eric Clapton was untouchable, the greatest guitarist Britain had ever produced. When Cream took the stage, other musicians didn't even try to compete. They just watched in awe. But on October 1st, 1966, everything changed. A skinny American kid walked into Clapton's concert at the Regent Street Polytechnic and asked if he could play a couple of songs. Clapton said yes. He shouldn't have. Halfway through the jam, Clapton did something he had never done before. He walked off his own stage. The greatest guitarist in Britain, the man they called God, couldn't handle being on the same stage as this unknown American. Backstage, Clapton was furious, smoking a cigarette, trying to process what just happened. And 48 hours later, when Jimi Hendrix played his first official concert in London, Clapton showed up, not to compete, to watch, to learn, to accept that the throne had a new king. September 24, 1966, 7 days before that fateful night at the Polytechnic, a 24-year-old American guitarist named Jimi Hendrix stepped off a plane at Heathrow Airport. He was carrying a single suitcase and a guitar case covered in stickers. Nobody knew who he was, nobody cared. But one person knew exactly what he had just brought to England. Chas Chandler, former bassist for the Animals, had discovered Jimi playing in a small club in Greenwich Village, New York. Chandler had watched Jimi play one song and immediately knew he was witnessing something that happened maybe once in a generation. He told Jimi, "Come to London. I'll introduce you to Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck. I'll make you a star." Jimi didn't ask about money. He didn't ask about contracts. He asked one question: "Will you really introduce me to Clapton?" That's all Jimi wanted, to meet his heroes, to play with the best, to prove he belonged on the same stage as the legends he'd idolized from across the ocean. Within 48 hours of landing in London, Chandler was already plugging Jimi into the scene. He brought him to small clubs, arranged jam sessions, spread the word that an incredible American guitarist was in town. But Chandler knew the real test would be Eric Clapton. At the time, Eric Clapton wasn't just famous, he was worshipped. After his work with the Yardbirds and John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, Clapton had formed Cream with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. They were the hottest band in Britain, and Eric Clapton was the reason. All over London, graffiti appeared on walls, bridges, buildings. Clapton is God. When people wrote that, they meant it. In 1966, if you wanted to hear the best guitar playing on planet Earth, you went to see Eric Clapton. There was no debate, no competition. Clapton was it. Chandler knew that if Jimi could just get on stage with Clapton, everything would change. So, on October 1st, 1966, Chandler brought Jimi to the London Polytechnic on Regent Street, where Cream was scheduled to perform. Jimi was nervous, more nervous than Chandler had ever seen him. They stood in the crowd as Cream took the stage, and Jimi watched Eric Clapton with something close to religious awe. This was his hero, the man whose records he'd studied, whose licks he'd learned note by note. Halfway through Cream's set, Chandler made his move. He went backstage and found Clapton during a break. "I've got a friend here, American guitarist. He'd love to jam with you guys for a song or two." Clapton shrugged. "Sure, why not?" In those days, musicians jammed together all the time. It was expected. It was how you showed respect, how you built community. Clapton was confident, relaxed. He'd jammed with dozens of guitarists. None of them had ever come close to his level. Clapton had no idea what was about to happen. Jimi walked onto the stage at the London Polytechnic, and the small crowd barely noticed. He was dressed in wild clothes, colorful, eccentric, nothing like what British musicians wore. His hair was a massive afro. He looked more like he'd walked out of a dream than a concert hall. Clapton watched him plug into Jack Bruce's bass amp. There wasn't a spare guitar amp available, and thought nothing of it. Just another American guitarist looking for his moment.
Someone in the band suggested they play Killing Floor by Howlin' Wolf. It was a brutal, driving blues song. Clapton had played it before, but never performed it live. It was tricky, demanding, the kind of song that could expose a guitarist's limitations. Jimi nodded. "Let's do it." The song started, and within 30 seconds, everyone in that room knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Jimi didn't just play Killing Floor, he destroyed it. He played behind his back, with his teeth. He bent strings in ways that shouldn't have been possible, coaxing sounds from the guitar that no one had heard before. His fingers moved across the fretboard like water, effortless and impossible at the same time. But here's what really got to Clapton. Jimi wasn't showing off. He wasn't trying to upstage anyone. He was just playing. This was how Jimi played. This was normal for him. Clapton stood frozen, his guitar hanging useless in his hands. He tried to keep playing, tried to match what Jimi was doing, but he couldn't. Nobody could. Jack Bruce, one of the best bassists in the world, was barely keeping up. Ginger Baker, the drummer, had his jaw hanging open. And then, halfway through the song, Eric Clapton, the man they called God, stopped playing. He put down his guitar, and he walked off his own stage. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. Was this part of the show? Was Clapton sick? But those who knew Clapton understood immediately. He hadn't quit because he was angry or insulted. He'd quit because there was no point in continuing. He'd just been outplayed so completely that staying on stage felt absurd. Backstage, Clapton was pacing, chain-smoking, his hands shaking slightly. Chandler found him and tried to talk, but Clapton cut him off. "You never told me he was that fucking good." Those 7 words contained everything: shock, admiration, fear, the realization that everything had just changed. Rock journalist Keith Altham was there that night, and he would later describe the scene. Clapton had walked off in the middle of a song he hadn't even mastered himself. He was furiously puffing on a cigarette, and he looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost. Jack Bruce, Cream's bassist, would later try to explain what they'd all witnessed. "It must have been difficult for Eric to handle," Bruce said, "because he was God, and this unknown person comes along and burns." But then Bruce added something that captured the truth better than anything else. Eric was a guitar player. Jimi was some sort of force of nature. That night, after the concert ended, Jimi went back to the small apartment Chandler had found for him. He wasn't sure what to make of what had happened. He'd just jammed with his hero, and his hero had walked off stage. Did he do something wrong? Should he have held back?
Chandler assured him, "You did exactly what you needed to do. Now everyone's talking about you." And they were. Within hours, word had spread through London's music scene. An American guitarist had made Eric Clapton walk off his own stage. Nobody knew who he was, but everyone wanted to see him. Chandler worked fast. Jimi's first official concert in London was already scheduled for October 3rd, just 48 hours away, at a club called the Bag of Nails. Chandler started making phone calls, calling in favors, spreading the word. If you want to see the future of rock and roll, be at the Bag of Nails on Tuesday night. October 3rd, 1966 arrived faster than Jimi expected. He was nervous again, but this time for different reasons. This wasn't a jam session. This was his debut, his chance to prove that what happened at the Polytechnic wasn't a fluke. When Jimi arrived at the Bag of Nails that evening, Chandler pulled him aside and pointed to the crowd gathering outside. "See those people? That's Keith Richards. That's Mick Jagger, Brian Jones, Jeff Beck, Pete Townshend, Paul McCartney, John Mayall." Jimi's eyes went wide. Every guitar hero in Britain was showing up to his first concert. And then Chandler pointed to someone else, and that's Eric Clapton. Clapton had come.
not to compete, not to reclaim his throne, but to watch, to witness, to accept what was happening. When Jimi took the stage that night at the Bag of Nails, something electric happened. The crowd was packed, the air thick with anticipation and cigarette smoke. These weren't casual fans. These were musicians, critics, journalists, the people who decided what mattered in British rock and roll. Jimi played for nearly 2 hours. He played blues, rock, songs nobody had heard before, songs that wouldn't be released for months. And with every note, every bend, every impossible thing he did with that guitar, the crowd grew quieter and more attentive. By the end of the night, nobody was talking. They were just watching, trying to process what they were seeing. Keith Richards would later say, "When Jimi played that night, every one of us realized we'd have to go back to the drawing board." Paul McCartney described it as like someone had opened a door we didn't know existed. Jeff Beck, another guitar legend, simply said, "I knew I'd never play guitar the same way again." But the most telling reaction came from Eric Clapton. 2 weeks after that night at the Bag of Nails, Clapton showed up to a Cream concert with a new look. He'd permed his hair into a massive afro just like Jimi's. He started leaving his guitar leaning against the amplifier during performances, letting feedback scream through the speakers, a trick he'd seen Jimi do. In an interview years later, Clapton was asked about that night at the Polytechnic. "I remember thinking," Clapton said, "that here was a force to be reckoned with. It scared me because he was clearly going to be a huge star, and just as we were finding our own speed, here was the real thing."
The real thing. That's what Clapton called Jimi. Not a competitor, not even an equal. The real thing. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Instead of becoming rivals, Jimi and Eric became close friends. Over the next 4 years, they played together constantly. They'd show up at each other's concerts, jam until dawn, share techniques and ideas. Clapton would later say that playing with Jimi was some of the most fun he'd ever had. It was easy, Clapton remembered. It felt like, was this the best band I ever played in terms of passion and technique and fun? Maybe it was. On September 17, 1970, Eric Clapton was shopping in London when he saw a left-handed Fender Stratocaster in a music shop window. He bought it immediately. Jimi was left-handed, and Clapton knew this would be the perfect gift. That night, there was a concert at the Lyceum featuring Sly Stone, and Clapton planned to give Jimi the guitar there. Jimi never showed up to the concert. The next morning, September 18, 1970, Eric Clapton woke up to the news that Jimi Hendrix was dead. An accidental overdose of sleeping pills. He was 27 years old. Clapton was devastated. For weeks, he couldn't talk about Jimi without breaking down. Even decades later in interviews, Clapton would choke up when discussing that night at the Polytechnic, those 4 years of friendship, and the gift he never got to give. "My life was never the same after he left the stage that night," Clapton said in 2018, "and it was never the same after he left this world." The story of Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton isn't really about a rivalry. It's about what happens when greatness recognizes greatness. It's about a man who was so secure in his own talent that he could walk off stage and admit he'd been beaten. And it's about a friendship that formed because Clapton had the wisdom to learn from the man who dethroned him. Today, there's a small music shop in London where Eric Clapton bought that left-handed Stratocaster. On the wall, there's a plaque that reads, "On this spot, Eric Clapton purchased a gift for Jimi Hendrix that would never be given, September 17, 1970. And if you go to the London Polytechnic, now the University of Westminster, there's a small memorial that commemorates October 1, 1966, the night everything changed. It reads, "Here, Jimi Hendrix played his first notes in England, and here, rock and roll was never the same."
48 hours. That's all it took. 48 hours from, "Who is this guy?" to, "Oh my God, he just changed everything." 48 hours from rejection to revolution. 48 hours from unknown to legend. Because sometimes the greatest journeys don't take years. Sometimes they take 2 days, one jam session, and the courage to show the world exactly who you are, even if it means making God walk off his own stage. If this story of talent, friendship, and the moment that changed rock and roll forever moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that greatness recognizes greatness, and that sometimes getting rejected is just the universe's way of setting up your greatest triumph. Drop a comment telling us about a time when someone doubted you and you proved them wrong. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the legends who shaped music history.